Antonia, dressed in her old and worn clothes, was cast out of her life by her own daughter just to appease a penniless aristocratic son-in-law. Preston demanded $50,000 to preserve his honor, but he had no clue that this poor mother actually held all of his family's debts. Hello, everyone. I'm Casey. Have you ever felt like a stranger in the very home you spent your whole life building? Today's story about Antonia Romano will make us pause and think about the true value of family and respect. Sometimes, our own flesh and blood treat us like strangers, while it's the strangers who become our only support when we fall apart. Join me as we step into Antonia's small kitchen, where a secret is about to be revealed, and a powerful lesson in dignity awaits those who are too arrogant. I sat there in my quiet kitchen in Providence, Rhode Island, feeling the heavy weight of the silence that filled the room. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like heavy hammer blows against my heart, marking every second of my isolation as an American woman in her late 60s. The morning sun filtered through the window, shining directly onto the thick, high-quality engagement invitation that Anna had brought over yesterday. It was elegant and flashy, the kind of paper that felt expensive to the touch, yet it radiated a strange, biting coldness. I reached out my fingers, grazing the embossed letters, stating that the Whitfield family cordially invites you. My own name, Antonia Romano, was tucked away in a small corner at the very bottom, as if it had been placed there only out of a reluctant sense of obligation. I took a sip of my coffee, which had gone completely cold, leaving a bitter taste that lingered in the back of my throat and mirrored the growing bitterness in my soul. My phone sat motionless on the table. For 3 days, Anna had not called back, using the silence as a cold punishment for some unknown sin. I had texted her several times to ask about the dinner menu at Russo's, the small Italian place her father always loved, but she ignored my input entirely, making me feel as though my voice no longer mattered in this family. I stood up, pulled on my old coat, and walked out to the yard where my 1995 Honda Civic sat waiting. That car was a relic from the days I worked double shifts at the bank, as a member of the working class, sacrificing my comfort to save every penny for her Stanford tuition. But to Anna now, it was nothing more than an embarrassment to her new refined life. She had told me not to drive that car to Newport, with her eyes darting away in shame so she would not have to look at me. She said that Preston would not like it. Right then, my phone buzzed. It was not Anna, but Maria, my assistant at Romano Financial. Her voice was filled with genuine respect and a warmth that I had not felt from my own blood in months, as she told me she had finished the asset report on the Whitfield family and asked if I needed some fresh coffee. I realized with a sharp, stinging pang that this stranger understood my habits and my needs better than the child I had carried and raised. While Maria worried about my well-being, my daughter was busy hiding my identity to please a self-proclaimed aristocrat. A new message popped up from Preston's number, telling me not to ruin the atmosphere of tonight's party with my appearance and demanding a $50,000 check if I wanted a decent wedding for my daughter. My heart tightened as he treated my life savings like his own property. It felt as if an invisible hand was squeezing the life out of me right in the middle of my own home, leaving me completely numb. I let my phone slip from my hand, watching it land softly on the worn oak table that has seen so many years of family meals and quiet mornings. Preston's demand for $50,000 echoed in my mind like a persistent, annoying noise that I just couldn't shake off. I slowly made my way to the bedroom, where an old photo album sat in its usual corner, its leather cover peeling and cracked with age. I felt a deep sense of sadness and regret as I reached for it, hoping to find a glimpse of the little girl Anna used to be before the high society of Newport swallowed her whole. As I turned the pages, A memory from the first time Preston stepped into this house came rushing back, as vivid as a movie playing in slow motion. He had stepped out of his gleaming luxury car wearing a tailored suit without a single wrinkle, looking like he belonged in a different world entirely. The moment he saw my battered 1995 Honda Civic sitting in the driveway, his eyebrows shot up in a look of pure disdain. He didn't even offer a greeting. Instead, he looked at my clothes, which were covered in oil stains because I had been busy fixing the fence myself, and he asked Anna in a condescending tone if I was her new gardener. The sharpest pain didn't come from his arrogance, but from Anna's silence. My own daughter just lowered her head, her face flushing red with shame instead of standing up for her mother. That pattern of behavior repeated itself with a cruel consistency over the past year. When Anna mentioned that I worked at a bank, Preston and his family immediately assumed I was just a janitor or a low-level teller because they couldn't imagine me being anything more. His mother, Catherine, would often give me these fake looks of pity during our brief encounters. At a tea party once, she said it was so precious that a woman like me could raise a daughter who graduated from Stanford, as if my existence was some sort of lowly stroke of luck or a stain on their dying aristocratic bloodline. I sat there and took it, feeling the loss of my own power and voice just as many women my age do in these changing family dynamics. I began to realize with a bitter clarity that every time that family appeared, they only brought demands. They needed money for their yacht clubs and their expensive parties just to keep up appearances in a world they could no longer afford. The reality of our relationship became painfully clear during one of my darkest moments. Last year, when I was rushed to the hospital with sharp chest pains, Preston convinced Anna to go with him to an art gallery opening in Aspen instead of staying by my side. The person who sat by my hospital bed all night, holding my cold hand, was Maria, my assistant, who they always dismissed as a stranger. Maria was the one who brought me warm soup and watched my every breath, while my own daughter sent a short text telling me to hang in there because she was too busy with Preston's family business. A cold and bitter awakening washed over me as I realized they were just biting the hand that fed them. I have stayed silent for far too long, trying to protect Anna's supposed happiness, but I cannot step back anymore. My tears of regret have dried up, replaced by a chilling and quiet determination. Preston wants $50,000 to buy his honor. Fine. I will show him the true price of honor when it is weighed on the scales of Romano Financial. There is a magical moment that happens when you finally decide to let go of the things that never truly belong to you. After that long night of realization, I understood that this big house did not need to be filled with the laughter of people who saw me as a burden just to feel warm again. This morning, for the first time in years, I did not reach for my phone the second I opened my eyes to check for missed calls or messages. I actually turned off the notifications entirely. The morning sun streamed into my bedroom, and I noticed that it did not feel harsh or biting anymore. I made myself a cup of Earl Grey tea and sat by the window watching my neighbors in Providence bustle about as they started their day. I whispered to myself that it was enough and that I would no longer be a slave to my own expectations. I drove to the office at Romano Financial, where Maria greeted me with her usual bright smile. Instead of burying myself in dry numbers, I looked at her and suggested we go to lunch early at Russo's. She looked at me with wide eyes of surprise before nodding excitedly. Sitting at that familiar table with the red and white checkered cloth, I shared secrets about my family's tomato sauce recipe that I had never told anyone before. I reached into my bag and gave her the Hermes silk scarf I had bought at the department store a while ago as a small thank you for her quiet presence over the years. Maria was so moved that her eyes filled with tears and she squeezed my hand, telling me I was like a second mother to her. Later that afternoon, I did not go straight home but instead stopped by the St. Jude Community Center. I had signed up for a senior gardening class. Surrounded by the scent of fresh lavender and the light-hearted chatter of people my own age, I felt like I truly belonged. We talked about how inflation was making the price of fertilizer and seeds at Home Depot skyrocket lately, but strangely enough, those worries did not feel heavy. I found myself laughing so hard that my face actually felt a bit tired. For the first time in 5 years, I realized my laughter did not carry that bitter aftertaste of loneliness. I returned home as the sunset painted the Providence sky in shades of deep purple. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. I realized then that family is not just about the blood in your veins, but about the people who choose to stay by your side when you have nothing left to give. A sense of relief spread through me as I took a deep breath, feeling free for the first time in the 40 years since I first became a mother. Is family always about blood relatives? Or are they the people who choose to stand by you during your stormiest times? Dear friends, have you ever found comfort from a stranger more than from your own flesh and blood? Please leave a comment and share your story. Casey is always here to listen. As I drove my old car toward the million-dollar mansions of Newport, I no longer carried the shattered heart of a rejected mother. Instead, I felt the calm and steady pulse of an observer. Preston thought he could use money and some hollow sense of honor to corner me, but that young socialite had no idea that he was the one standing on the very edge of a cliff. I steered my 1995 Honda Civic onto Bellevue Avenue, where the massive ancient oak trees cast long shadows over the magnificent granite estates. The rattling sound of my old engine felt completely out of place among the sea of gleaming Teslas and Range Rovers. In the past, this feeling of being an outsider would have made me shrink back in shame, worrying about how my presence might affect Anna's reputation. But today, it just seemed ridiculous. I parked the car right in front of a high-end cafe where Preston and Anna were waiting. Through the glass window, I saw Preston looking annoyed as he checked his Rolex while Anna fiddled with an expensive designer handbag that I knew she had bought with her own dwindling savings. I took a deep breath, feeling the determination flowing through my veins, and I walked inside. The moment he saw me, Preston did not even bother to stand up. He just gestured toward the chair opposite him, as if he were granting me a great favor. He told me I was 10 minutes late, speaking in a cold voice without even looking away from his phone screen. He said he hoped I had brought what we agreed upon. He explained that the guest list at the yacht club had been finalized, and the $50,000 deposit had to be paid by 5 o'clock that afternoon, or else the wedding would be treated as if it never existed. Anna looked at me with pleading eyes, asking me to understand that Preston's family took these procedures very seriously and begging for my help. I did not answer her right away. I calmly ordered a black espresso with no sugar and took my time looking directly into Preston's eyes. I finally spoke his name in a low but very clear voice. I asked him why a family with such a long and storied lineage like the Whitfields would need $50,000 from a lowly bank teller like me just to buy honor for a wedding. Preston froze, and his eyebrows shot up in pure surprise. He had never heard me ask a question back like that before. He let out a condescending laugh and leaned back in his chair. He told me it was a contribution to prove that I was worthy of being related to them through marriage. He said I should feel honored to contribute to an event of this magnitude instead of questioning him like a stingy person. He intentionally spoke loudly so that the people at the nearby tables would notice us. Anna grabbed my hand and whispered for me to please stop making things more complicated. I looked down at Anna's hand and saw that it was trembling. My daughter was terrified of a man who was essentially penniless. I smiled then, a smile that Maria often called my killer contract smile. I told him I understood, but given the current state of inflation and the difficulties many trust funds were facing, I thought I needed to consider this investment more carefully. Preston slammed his hand down on the table and demanded to know what I meant by calling it an investment. He shouted that this was my obligation and asked if I knew how many people would kill for this position. He began using words that mocked my immigrant background, telling me I should know my place. Those words would have cut me deep in the past, but now they were just evidence of how pathetic he truly was. I stood up and straightened my old coat, making sure every button was in place. I told him firmly that I would not be giving him that check today. I told him it was not because I did not have the money, but because I wanted to see exactly how much their family honor was worth when my money was not on the table. Preston's face went pale with rage, and he screamed that I would regret this, and that the wedding was canceled. I turned to Anna and saw her crying, but I did not let my heart soften this time. I needed her to see the truth. I told her that if her love was only worth $50,000, then it had already ended a long time ago. I walked out of the cafe and felt the brilliant Newport sun on my shoulders. All my anxiety had vanished, replaced by a sense of absolute confidence. I pulled out my phone and called Maria. I told her to activate the ethical review clause for the mortgage debt on the Whitfield estate because I wanted a detailed report on my desk by tomorrow morning. The moment I stepped out of that cafe in Newport, I knew I had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. I had refused Preston, the man my daughter worshipped like a golden ticket into a world of status and luxury. But I did not expect that my resistance would lead to a much more brutal confrontation at the Whitfield estate just a few hours later. I drove there not to hand over a check, but to try and bring my daughter home. I stood before the heavy iron gates of the Whitfield mansion, a place that looked like a temple of wealth but felt like a mausoleum. The Renaissance architecture with its white marble pillars looked magnificent in the fading light, yet it radiated a chilling coldness that made my skin crawl. The sound of my old Honda's tires grinding on the expensive gravel driveway felt like a loud, rattling warning in the quiet afternoon, a stark contrast to the silence of the people inside. As soon as I entered the living room, the scent of expensive lavender candles hit me, but it did not make me feel relaxed. Catherine was sitting on a velvet armchair, her spine as rigid as the bone china teacup she held. Reginald, Preston's father, stood by the window, swirling a crystal glass of amber cognac while looking out at the gardens he likely couldn't afford to maintain anymore. Preston stood in the middle of the room, his face flushed with a dark, entitled red anger, and Anna, my Anna, sat huddled on the sofa, her eyes swollen from hours of crying. The air in the room was thick and suffocating, as if I were a contaminant that had just invaded their private sanctuary. Reginald spoke first, his voice deep and carrying the heavy weight of unearned privilege. He did not even look at me, keeping his eyes on the horizon as he told me that my presence there without the agreed-upon funds was an insult to his family's time and their honor. Preston stepped toward me, closing the distance until I could smell the sharp, overpowering scent of his cologne. He began to mock me openly, his voice rising as he talked about how his mother had ordered silver tableware directly from France for this wedding. He asked if a woman like me had any idea what it cost to maintain an aristocratic lineage in a world that was becoming increasingly expensive. He let out a condescending laugh, scanning my simple, worn clothes, and remarked that a woman who spent her whole life counting small change at a bank teller window could never truly understand the value of a dinner at the yacht club. Catherine set her teacup down with a sharp, echoing clink, telling me it was ridiculous how they had tried to elevate my daughter while I continued to drag her back into the mud of my working-class reality. She asked me if I knew what people in Newport called people like me. She called me a hanger-on and said I should be grateful they didn't hold the wedding in a church basement with paper plates to match my background. My ears began to ring, and my heart hammered against my ribs, not from the fear I felt earlier, but from a deep, agonizing pain as I saw Anna remain silent. My daughter said nothing to defend me. She just stared at the floor, as if that Persian rug were more important than the dignity of the mother who had worked double shifts and sacrificed every comfort to put her through Stanford. I felt a sudden, sharp sense of isolation, the kind of social abandonment many women my age fear when their children turn against them for the sake of a partner. I wanted to reach out to her, to scream her name, and ask how she could let them treat me like a servant in her presence. But then, a voice rose up from deep inside me, firmer and colder than anything I had ever felt before. I told them all to stop, and every head in the room snapped toward me. I walked right up to Preston, looking directly into his startled eyes, and I asked him how he could dare speak of honor while he was actively trying to blackmail a woman he claimed to despise. I told him that they didn't want my money for silver or for a yacht club. They wanted it because their own foundations were crumbling. I felt the hot blood rushing through my veins as the years of being the passive support system for my family vanished in an instant. I told them they could insult my background, my car, and my clothes, but they were the ones starving for every penny in my bank account. I looked at Reginald and Catherine and told them that was not being aristocratic. It was being pathetic. Reginald slammed his glass down, splashing cognac onto the rug, and ordered me to get out of his house immediately. Preston turned to Anna and gave her a choice, the kind of ultimatum that tears a family apart. He told her she had to choose between me or the life he could give her in Newport. I looked at Anna, waiting for the girl I raised to stand up, hoping that our bond still meant more than a title. But she stood up trembling and walked toward Preston instead of me. She sobbed and told me to go, crying that I was ruining everything she had ever wanted. The world around me seemed to collapse in that moment, leaving me with a sense of exhaustion that went deep into my bones. I felt betrayed by my own flesh and blood. I turned my back and walked away, my feet feeling like they were made of lead as I exited their home. But as I passed through the mansion gates into the cold Rhode Island night, a new kind of strength rose within me. I was no longer just a mother grieving a lost relationship. I was a woman who had built her own empire through Romano Financial while they were busy spending their ancestors' leftovers. I pulled out my phone and called Maria, my voice steady and certain as the Atlantic tide. I told her to activate the audit on the Whitfield Trust and to freeze any accounts linked to their mortgage debt immediately. I told her it was time they learned what it was like to actually work for a living, even if they had to do it off of paper plates. That night, Newport faded slowly in the rearview mirror, and the flickering yellow lights of those massive mansions grew dim like a broken dream that I was finally waking up from. I drove in absolute silence, without any music or radio, just the steady and persistent hum of my old Honda Civic engine as I made my way back to Providence. That car was a relic of my working-class roots, a reminder of the years I spent building everything from nothing, and in that moment, its reliability felt more comforting than any luxury could ever be. Anna's betrayal had left my heart bleeding, but the slap of the Whitfield's arrogance had served as a final, necessary wake-up call. By the time I stepped into my apartment, I was no longer the frail, aging mother who had been cast aside. I was Antonia Romano, and I was returning to my true sanctuary of power. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm even had a chance to ring. I felt a sense of focus that I hadn't known in years. I bypassed my usual comfortable clothes and reached into the back of my closet for a tailored business suit, an expensive piece of armor I usually kept hidden behind my old t-shirts. I stepped into the headquarters of Romano Financial with a completely different energy. The security guards bowed their heads in respect, and department directors stepped aside to clear a path for me as I walked toward the executive suite. The air in the office felt crisp and professional, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the Whitfield estate. Maria was already waiting in my office with a thick stack of files, her eyes filled with a deep sense of empathy and readiness. She asked if I was ready, calling me Madam President with a tone that recognized the weight of what we were about to do. I nodded, taking a sip of hot black coffee that felt grounding. I told her we needed to start with the mortgage files for the Willows in Newport. As I looked over the numbers, the reality was even grimmer than I had suspected. The Whitfield family owed my bank $4.2 million, and they had already missed 2 consecutive payments. In the past, I had quietly instructed the credit department to extend their grace period because of Anna, wanting to protect her future happiness. But that leniency had officially reached its end. We began to dig deeper into the trust fund that Preston had been living off of, and what we found was truly disgusting. It became clear that Preston had been treating the fund, which was originally established for charitable activities and family preservation, like a personal piggy bank. He had been using the money to pay for lavish vacations in Saint-Tropez, tailored luxury suits, and even to cover significant underground gambling debts. Even worse, I discovered that he was attempting to trick Anna into signing a prenuptial agreement that would force her to take on all of his personal debts after the wedding. A cold electric shiver ran down my spine as I realized they didn't just want my money. They were willing to destroy my daughter's entire life to save their own. I felt a surge of cold, strategic anger. I ordered Maria to activate the morality clause within the trust agreement immediately. I explained to her that their behavior, insulting others based on their social class and origins, combined with the blatant misuse of funds for personal gain, was a direct and serious violation of our banking regulations and ethical standards. Over the next several hours, I worked closely with Maria and my legal team to build an impenetrable defense system. We weren't using physical force. We were using the absolute weight of the law. The first step was to issue a formal notice of default and a demand for the foreclosure of the Whitfield mansion within 30 days if the full balance was not paid. The second step was to freeze Preston's trust accounts pending an investigation into his financial misconduct. The most important step, however, was establishing a separate, protected trust for Anna. I set it up with one ironclad condition. She could only access the funds once she had completely and legally terminated her relationship with Preston Whitfield IV. I knew I was building a golden cage in a way, but it was a cage meant to protect a lost bird, not to imprison her. I knew Anna would likely hate me for this, at least for now, but that was a price I was more than willing to pay to save her from the ruin those people would bring upon her. As the sun began to set, my office was flooded with a deep amber light. Maria placed the final set of documents on my desk for my signature. She asked me softly if I had any regrets. I looked out the window toward the Atlantic Ocean, feeling the vastness of the world outside of Newport. I told her that for many years, I had tried to be a kind and gentle mother by constantly giving in and compromising. But I realized now that sometimes The greatest form of love is a period of ruthless discipline. I felt a strange and wonderful sense of security spreading through me. The fear of being abandoned by my child and the pain of their insults had been replaced by a sharp, high-level focus. I was no longer a victim in my own story. I had regained total control over my life, and more importantly, I had reclaimed the power to see that justice was served. I went home and made myself a simple plate of pasta with marinara sauce, enjoying the meal in a state of proud and quiet dignity. That night, I knew I would sleep very well, because I knew the defense lines were fully established, and the arrogant people who looked down on me were about to face a reality they had spent their whole lives trying to ignore. After the exhausting hours of sifting through cold numbers and rigid legal clauses, I finally returned to the quiet rhythm of my everyday life. But today, my home in Providence did not have that hollow, lonely feeling that had haunted me for so long. It felt like the air itself had shifted. On Saturday afternoon, a typical Rhode Island chill began to settle over the neighborhood. I was in my kitchen, clumsily trying to organize the lavender seeds I had just bought from my gardening class, when the doorbell rang. It was Maria. She did not arrive with a thick stack of files or a look of corporate urgency as she usually did. Instead, she was holding a baking tray covered with a crisp white cloth, and the warm, comforting scent of cinnamon and red apples immediately filled the entryway. She told me she knew I loved traditional baked apple pie and gave me a smile that held a deep and genuine sense of care in her eyes. We sat together at the small kitchen table, sipping hot tea and enjoying the pie. For once, Maria did not mention the bank, and she did not bring up the Whitfields. Instead, she told me stories about her grandmother, an Italian immigrant who had built a successful bakery from nothing with her bare hands. She shared a piece of advice her grandmother used to give, saying that a person's true dignity is found in how they treat those who have less than them, not in how they flatter those who have more. I looked at her, and a wave of emotion washed over me that I could not quite describe. My assistant, someone I had always viewed mainly through the lens of our professional work, was the only person who truly saw my pain and knew how to soothe it with a simple, heartfelt slice of home. The next morning, at the St. Jude Community Center for my gardening class, I received another unexpected surprise. Mr. Miller, a quiet veteran who usually kept to himself, walked over and handed me a small packet of heirloom rose seeds. He spoke in a gravelly but very sincere voice, telling me he had noticed I seemed a bit troubled over the last few weeks. He told me not to let the cold Newport sea breezes wither my spirit. He said that a rose needs its thorns to protect its beauty, and that I was no different. These new friends of mine had no idea that I was the chairperson of a successful financial firm. To them, I was just Antonia, the woman who loved planting lavender and who always took the time to listen to stories about their grandchildren. That pure and uncomplicated respect made me realize how many years I had wasted trying to force myself into a hollow and decaying high society that never truly wanted me. I went back home with a heart overflowing with gratitude. I realized that I had found my chosen family, people who loved me for exactly who I am, not for what I could provide for them or what I could buy for them. Maria's presence and Mr. Miller's encouragement felt like a new surge of power being poured into my soul. I picked up my phone and looked at a photo of Anna smiling next to Preston, but this time, the sharp sting of betrayal was gone. I was not alone anymore. I had a team standing behind me, and I knew deep down that I was doing the right thing for both of us. A strange and wonderful peace settled over me, preparing me for the raw and difficult truth that was about to be revealed. In those difficult moments, who was the person who appeared and gave you strength? Was it a close friend, a colleague, or just a stranger you happened to meet? I believe that each of us has an anonymous guardian angel like that. Please do not hesitate to share the story of your wonderful ally in the comments below so that we can spread this warmth together. The peace I had found in my gardening class and the warmth of my small kitchen did not make me forget my fundamental duty as a mother. I knew that to truly save Anna from the path she was on, I could not simply rely on maternal love or gentle persuasion. I had to use the truth, the rawest and most painful truth that would strip away every illusion she held dear. That night, I found myself back at the office on the 42nd floor of Romano Financial. Outside the window, the neon lights of the city of Providence flickered against the dark Atlantic horizon, but inside the room was dim lit only by the glow of computer monitors and a single desk lamp. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, as if the building itself knew that the foundation of a prominent Newport dynasty was about to crumble. Across from me sat Maria, her face etched with a seriousness that mirrored my own. Between us lay bank statements, credit profiles, and internal memos, all marked with the bold red stamp of top secret. As we began to sift through the mountains of data, the deeper we went into the numbers, the heavier my breathing became. The Whitfield family was not just simply facing a temporary rough patch or the typical decline of old money in a modern economy. They were standing on the absolute brink of a financial collapse that would send shockwaves through the Rhode Island social scene. The Willows, the magnificent granite mansion that they used as a weapon of intimidation against me, was a hollow shell. Our investigation revealed that the estate had been used as overlapping collateral for 3 different high-interest loans from various offshore entities. They were living in a house of cards, praying that the wind would not blow. But even that discovery was not the worst of it. Maria handed me a thin folder bound in a dark navy blue leather. She told me in a voice that was nearly a whisper that I needed to look at page 14 of the draft prenuptial agreement Preston intended for Anna to sign. Her hand was actually trembling with a quiet rage as she pointed to the fine print. I squinted my eyes to read every tiny line carefully hidden under layers of complex legal jargon and archaic banking terms. A cold chill ran down my spine that felt like a blade of ice. Preston did not just want Anna to marry into his family for status. He had embedded a clause for an unlimited liability trust. According to this specific legal maneuver, if the two of them were to marry, Anna would unknowingly become the sole guarantor for all of Preston's personal loans and his father's failing real estate projects. This was a death sentence disguised as a marriage contract. It meant that if they married and the Whitfield family declared bankruptcy, which our projections showed was almost certain to happen in the next 6 months, then Anna's entire career, her Stanford degree, and her entire future earnings would be seized by creditors to pay off their generational debts. The man my daughter loved, the one who had spent months lecturing me on honor and the importance of a noble lineage, was actually looking for a sacrificial lamb to slaughter. He did not love Anna for who she was. He loved her impeccable educational credentials and the massive financial potential he hoped to squeeze out of me after the wedding was finalized and the legal trap was sprung. The disgust rose in my throat like a bitter poison, making it hard to swallow. But Maria wasn't finished yet. She flipped to another report showing that Preston had been secretly siphoning money from the family education fund, money that was legally set aside for the next generation. He had used it to pay for a secret luxury apartment in Manhattan for an ex-mistress. To cover his tracks, he had been forging his own father's signature on withdrawal slips for the past 2 years. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, feeling the entire room begin to spin around me. This truth was far more horrifying than anything I had imagined in my darkest moments. This was not a story of an aristocratic family in a sad decline. This was a den of professional scammers hiding behind expensive tailored suits and high society dinner parties. They had the audacity to look at me with contempt because of my old clothes and my working class roots, while their own souls were more decayed than anything found in a city landfill. Every illusion I had of Anna finding a prestigious and safe life with this family had completely shattered. I remembered the image of her sobbing in that mansion, telling me to go because I was ruining everything for her. My heart tightened with a fresh wave of agony. My poor sweet Anna had no interest in the truth because she was too busy chasing a fairy tale that was actually a deadly trap, where love was just a slave contract signed in the blood of her future. I looked out the window where the dark waves of the Atlantic were crashing relentlessly against the rocky shore, and I felt a transformation happening within me. I told Maria in a voice that was now as cold and sharp as a surgical blade to prepare a full and final dossier. I wanted every single piece of evidence from the fraudulent mortgage debts to the high-resolution scans of the forged signatures. I told her we would not be sending this to their high-priced lawyers or trying to negotiate a settlement behind closed doors. I paused for a long time, my gaze fixed on the lights of the Newport Bridge in the distance. I decided then that I would deliver this truth directly to my daughter. It was time for Anna to see the real face of the prince she had dreamed of, even if that sight would break her heart into 1,000 pieces. The truth was finally out in the open, and this absolute clarity gave me a strength I had never known before. There was no more room for hesitation or the quiet grief of a rejected mother. There was only the cold, hard responsibility of a protector. I gathered the files into my bag and walked out of the office with a completely different mindset. This game of wits and status was far from over, but now I was the one holding every winning card on the scales of justice. Darkness is always the time when the most painful truths come to disturb our minds. As I held the dossier exposing the Whitfield family's plot in my hands, I felt as if I were standing in the middle of a New England blizzard, cold and blindingly white. I returned to my silent house in Providence and did not turn on the lights. I sat down in the old leather armchair that belonged to Antonio, my husband. It has been 10 years since he passed away, but the faint scent of sandalwood and machine oil still seemed to linger on the worn leather. I reached out my hand and touched the silver pocket watch sitting on the side table, the only heirloom he brought with him when he came to America from Sicily. It was not a luxury brand like Preston's Rolex, but it had run faithfully through many seasons of economic recession and the long years when we saved every spare penny to open our first office. I closed my eyes, and the image of Antonio appeared before me. I remembered his rough hands as he stroked Anna's hair when she was a little girl. His voice sounded deep and low in my mind, telling me never to let anyone define my value by the things they have. He always said that the value of a Romano lies in what they are willing to sacrifice to maintain their integrity. Preston and his parents looked at my labor as something inferior. They used the title of aristocrats to cover their parasitic nature. But here, in this quiet room, I saw clearly what true wealth actually looks like. It was not the Willows mansion that was buried in overlapping mortgages. It was the nights my husband and I stayed awake at the kitchen table, learning about financial law, and the dinners that consisted only of simple pasta, but were filled with laughter and honesty. We built the Romano Group not by cheating or using legal loopholes to blackmail others, but through the trust of our community. I realized that I had almost let my love for my daughter allow those decaying people to trample on the spiritual legacy Antonio had left behind. The Providence moonlight streamed through the window, silvering the old watch. The feeling of choking pain and heartache gradually faded away, replaced by a rock-solid sense of peace. I no longer felt afraid of facing Anna's anger or the Whitfield family's tactics. I am the wife of Antonia Romano, a woman who rose from nothing with her own two hands. I stood up and gripped the watch tightly in my hand as if I were holding onto a vow. I whispered to the empty room that I would not let them ruin her and that I would show them the true strength of a real family. A sense of steadfastness burned within me, stronger and more brilliant than any diamond the Whitfields could ever own. I opened the dossier once more, but this time my eyes held no trace of horror. There was only the determination of a hunter who has finally seen the target. The final battle was approaching, and I was ready. Monday morning in Rhode Island usually brings a certain kind of clarity with the sun rising over the cold, gray waters of Narragansett Bay. But this particular Monday began with a hollow thud that changed everything. I was sitting in my kitchen, wrapped in a thick cardigan, holding a warm cup of licorice tea, and trying to find a moment of peace before the work week began. Then came the knocking. It was not a friendly tap from a neighbor, but a sharp, authoritative sound that echoed through the quiet house. When I opened the door, a courier handed me a thick, heavy envelope with the embossed seal of the most expensive law firm in Newport. Summons and notice of intent to sue. The words were printed in a bold, clinical font that seemed designed to intimidate. Preston was suing me for defamation and what his lawyers called intentional interference with financial operations. He was asking for $5 million in damages. I looked at that number and almost had to laugh because it was the exact amount I knew he owed in various failing ventures. The sheer audacity of it sent a jolt through my system. It was not a jolt of fear, but a realization of just how far these people would go to protect their hollow lives. They were using the very legal system I had built my career on to try and break me. They thought that by dragging a working-class woman into a high-priced legal battle, they could force me into submission. I picked up the phone and called Maria. My voice was so steady and calm that it surprised even me as I told her that the fish had finally taken the bait. I instructed her to schedule a meeting at Lawyer Stevens' office for that afternoon, and I told her very clearly to make sure she brought the file on the Manhattan apartment. I spent the rest of the morning not in a panic, but in a state of focused preparation, because I knew that the mask of the Whitfield family was about to be ripped away for good. The conference room on the top floor of the legal center in Newport felt like a tomb designed by an interior decorator. It was filled with the heavy scent of polished mahogany and expensive leather that seemed to absorb all the light and oxygen in the room. Preston was already there, looking polished in a dark suit. But the skin around his eyes was hack and gray, betraying the stress he was trying to hide. Beside him sat a lawyer who wore a practiced industrial smile that did not reach his cold eyes. Reginald and Catherine sat behind them like statues of a bygone era, their faces fixed in that same false mask of aristocratic superiority that they used to look down on anyone they deemed beneath them. As I sat down, I could feel the psychological weight they were trying to place on me, making the air feel thick and suffocating. The lawyer began to speak in a voice that was as slick as machine oil. He claimed that my actions in freezing the trust fund were a blatant and illegal abuse of my position. He called me a mere record manager, as if my decades of hard work were nothing more than filing papers, and he said I had no legal right to touch the legacy of a family like the Whitfields. He threatened that not only would they make sure I lost my job, but they would pursue me personally until I had to sell my old house and everything I owned just to pay for my supposed arrogance. I stayed silent throughout his entire speech, just looking directly at Preston, who was sitting there with a smug nech-mep on his face. He leaned in close until I could smell the sharp scent of his expensive cologne, and he whispered into my ear, He asked me who I thought I was and called me a lucky immigrant woman who had managed to get a seat at a bank through some fluke of diversity. He told me that if I did not unlock the accounts and sign another check for $100,000, right then, he would make sure Anna never looked at me again. He said he would tell her that I was a thief who had been secretly using their family money for my own gain. The feeling of being violated by his lies made my hands tremble for a split second. The unfairness of it all, and the thought that my daughter might actually believe this monster over her own mother created a moment of deep and agonizing helplessness. But then I felt the cool, solid weight of Antonio's silver pocket watch in my coat pocket, and the memory of his words about integrity brought me back to myself. I reached into my bag and slowly placed a series of photographs onto the polished wooden table. I began to speak in a focused voice that seemed to vibrate through the quiet room as I mentioned apartment number 402 on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I watched as Preston's face shifted from arrogant to a sickly gray as I explained that while the lease was in his name, every single payment had been siphoned from the Whitfield Family Education Fund through a forged signature of his own father. I looked at the lawyer and asked if they really wanted to continue a conversation about the law. I told them that forgery and embezzlement were federal crimes, and that according to the morality clause in the credit agreement their family had signed with Romano Financial, the entire $4.2 million mortgage for their estate would be recalled immediately if any fraudulent behavior was discovered. Reginald stood up so suddenly that his heavy chair toppled over with a crash against the mahogany floor. He shouted at me, demanding to know how a lowly teller could have access to such information. I stood up then as well, and I looked directly into the eyes of the man who was now visibly shaking with fear. I told him very clearly that I was not a lowly teller. I told him my name was Antonia Romano, and that I was the founder and the chairperson of Romano Financial. I told him that every single cent his family owed was owed to me personally. The silence that followed was so profound that you could actually hear the low hum of the air conditioning system. Catherine let out a small gasp and dropped her designer handbag onto the floor with a dull thud. Preston sat there with his mouth hanging open, his eyes clouded with a realization of the disaster he had brought upon himself. He tried to muster one last threat, shouting that Anna would never believe me because she loved him, and she believed in the life he offered. At that exact moment, the heavy doors of the conference room swung open, and Maria walked in with Anna right behind her. My daughter had been standing in the outer office, and she had heard everything. She had heard about the secret apartment in New York and the plan to use her as a legal shield for their mounting debts. Anna looked at Preston with a look of pure disgust, as if she were seeing a cockroach in a five-star restaurant. She told him that her mother had never once lied to her, and that only a family as decaying as his would think that the truth was something that could be bought or buried. I walked over to Anna and took her cold hands in mine, feeling a wave of maternal protection that was stronger than any legal contract. I no longer felt small or helpless in that room of mahogany and leather. I looked at Preston one last time with a gaze that held only cold contempt. I told him that the meeting was over and that they had exactly 24 hours to pack their things and vacate the Willows before the bank's enforcement team arrived to change the locks. I told him to never use the word honor in my presence ever again because he wouldn't know the meaning of it if it hit him in the face. Witnessing the moment Antonia finally pulled back the curtain on those people was a powerful relief, wasn't it? Do you believe that honesty and dignity will always win against the dirty tactics of the greedy? Have you ever had to stand your ground and protect your family from people who only saw you as a target? Please share your thoughts and leave a comment saying, "Resilient if you stand with Antonia." After the intense storm at the lawyer's office, a strange and heavy silence settled over Newport. I went back to my home in Providence, where the lavender pots on my porch began to release a soft, calming fragrance in the warm evening sun. I was no longer rushing, and the frantic worry that had lived in my chest for months had finally vanished. Everything had been set in its proper place, like the organized files on my desk at Romano Financial. Tonight was the final night before the scales of justice would deliver their official verdict, and I knew deep down that the most important victory was not the numbers in a ledger or the property deeds I held. The real victory was the heart of my daughter, who was slowly but surely finding her way back to the truth and to her home. I was sitting on my porch, watching the white seagulls circle far off on the Rhode Island horizon, when I heard a car pull into the driveway. It was not the aggressive roar of Preston's luxury engine, but the sound of hesitant, tired footsteps on the gravel. Anna stood there, looking like a different person. Her expensive designer dress was wrinkled, and her makeup was smeared from hours of tears. She did not say a word at first. She just looked at me with an expression of pure realization and deep shame. Then she simply ran into my arms and sobbed. I held her tightly, feeling the warmth and the trembling of the child I had carried, raised and sacrificed everything for. She apologized over and over through her tears, whispering that she had been so blind and so foolish to believe their lies. I did not blame her. I did not say "I told you so," because a mother's love does not need to be right to be powerful. I just gently stroked her hair, the way I have for 25 years, and let her cry. I understood that the greatest punishment for Anna was not losing the wedding or the status, but the raw, stinging truth about the man she had given her heart to. We sat there for a long time in the gathering silence of the sunset, letting the pain begin to heal through nothing but unconditional love and the honesty that had finally returned to our house. Throughout the evening, my phone buzzed constantly on the kitchen counter. There were missed calls from Reginald, long and fake apologies in texts from Catherine, and a desperate mix of threats and pleas from Preston. They talked about our family connections and unfortunate misunderstandings, asking me to think about the honor of both of our houses and the social fallout of my actions. I looked at those messages and smiled a very bitter, quiet smile. When they were busy insulting me with words about paper plates, church basements, and low-class workers, they certainly were not thinking about anyone's honor but their own. Now that their estate, the Willows, was about to be sealed, and their personal accounts were frozen by the bank's audit, they suddenly remembered that I was a mother, a business partner, and a human being worthy of their time. I put the phone face down on the table and did not answer a single one of them. My silence was the most powerful and definitive response I could give. I had given them so many opportunities to show even a shred of genuine kindness, but they had consistently chosen arrogance and greed. Now, they would have to learn how to face the consequences of their own choices in a world that no longer owed them anything. Early the next morning, I woke up before the sun, feeling a sense of lightness that I had not felt since Antonia was still with me. I went into the kitchen and prepared a simple traditional breakfast of toast and peanut butter, the same meal Anna had loved since she was in high school. She came down the stairs eventually, her eyes still a bit swollen from the night before, but there was a new and quiet determination in her gaze that I had not seen in a long time. She sat at the table and ate with me, and then she told me in a steady voice that she was going with me to the bank. She wanted to stand by me when the final papers were signed. I opened my briefcase one last time, checking the final documents that Maria had carefully prepared. Every piece of evidence regarding the forged signatures and the embezzlement of the trust fund was there, ready to be handed over to the legal department and the authorities if they chose to fight. I was not doing any of this to humiliate them. I was doing it to protect what was right and to preserve the integrity of the institution I had built. I wanted to teach Anna one last vital lesson. Money and status can be taken away in a heartbeat, but your dignity and your integrity are things that no one in this world can take from you unless you allow them to. I drove my old 1995 Honda Civic toward the towering headquarters of Romano Financial. This time, I did not feel out of place or embarrassed by the rattling of the engine. Anna sat in the passenger seat, reaching over to hold my hand tightly as we crossed the Newport Bridge. The bright morning sun reflected off the deep blue waters of the bay, making the whole world look clear and new. I felt stronger and more centered than I ever had in my entire life. As we walked through the glass doors of the bank lobby, I saw Maria waiting for us with a bright, supportive smile. Further off, in the glass-walled VIP lounge, the Whitfield family was already sitting there. From a distance, they looked small and incredibly panicked in the middle of the luxury they used to claim as their birthright. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of absolute freedom in my soul. I was no longer the poor mother they tried to hide, or the lowly teller they tried to intimidate. I was Antonia Romano, and today, I would finally close a long and painful chapter to open a new future where respect was the only language spoken and honesty was the only currency that mattered. We walked into the meeting room together, and I knew that justice was finally about to be served. The heavy oak doors of the 42nd floor conference room opened wide, welcoming us with a stream of cool air and the professional scent of fresh ink and expensive stationery. Anna held my hand tightly, and I could feel that her grip was no longer trembling with the uncertainty she had shown back in Newport. Her palm was steady, and her stride was purposeful. As we walked toward the massive marble table that spanned the center of the room, I felt a strange and comforting warmth on my shoulder, as if Antonio himself were walking right beside me, whispering that it was time to finish what we had started 40 years ago. Across that vast expanse of cold stone, the Whitfield family sat huddled together, looking like a group of castaways rather than the lords of the manor they pretended to be. In their eyes, I no longer saw the biting contempt or the sneering arrogance that had defined our every interaction. Now, there was only a raw and naked terror, the kind felt by people who have lived their entire lives on a stage and suddenly realize the curtain is being torn down for good. I did not take a seat in the area reserved for guests. Instead, I walked slowly and with deliberate weight to the high-backed chair at the head of the table, the seat belonging to the chairperson. I sat down and looked at them, and for the first time, I felt the true scale of the power I had spent my life building. Maria placed a deep red folder in front of me, and the silence that followed was so profound, you could actually hear the frantic and shallow rhythm of Preston's breathing. Reginald cleared his throat, trying one last time to summon that old fake aristocratic tone that had served him for decades. He spoke about family, and about how internal disagreements were best handled behind closed doors to protect the honor of both houses. He actually had the nerve to suggest that we were all on the same side, and that a private settlement would be the most dignified path forward for everyone involved. I raised my hand in a sharp and definitive gesture that silenced him in the middle of a sentence. I told him calmly, and with a voice that carried the weight of the entire building, that we were never family, and we never would be. I explained to him that in my world, family does not blackmail one another, and they do not use filthy words to mock a person's origins or their hard work. I told him that a real family does not view their children as insurance policies or sacrificial lambs to be traded away for the sake of covering up dirty debts. Maria then began to read from the documents in a voice that was professionally cold and surgically precise. She announced that based on the morality clause and the blatant breach of fiduciary duty within the Whitfield Trust, Romano Financial was officially and permanently freezing all of Preston's accounts to facilitate a federal investigation into his forged signatures. She also stated that the foreclosure notice for their estate, the Willows, was now in full effect due to 90 days of non-payment and a total failure to provide financial transparency. Catherine let out a small and high-pitched cry of horror, her hands shaking so violently that she dropped her gold-rimmed glasses onto the marble table with a sharp and echoing clink. Preston lunged forward, his face twisting into a mask of pure rage and absolute desperation as he accused me of intentionally destroying the Whitfield name and his legacy. I looked at him, and I did not feel the anger I expected to feel. Instead, I felt a deep and hollow sense of pity for a man who had never known the value of earning a single thing in his life. I told him that his family had destroyed its own name a long time ago through their own greed and their endless cycle of lies. I explained that I was simply the one clearing away the ruins so that the rot of their house would not be allowed to stain my daughter for another second. At that moment, Anna stood up and moved away from the side of the table where Preston was sitting. She looked at him with a gaze that held no trace of the sadness or the longing I had seen just days before. She told him that while he claimed to love her for her intelligence and her Stanford education, he really just wanted a human shield to hide his own laziness and his mounting failures. She pointed out the incredible hypocrisy of a man who insulted her mother for driving an old car while he hungered for the very money that car had helped earn through decades of honest labor. She officially called off the wedding right then and there and told him to never speak to her or her mother again. She slid her engagement ring onto the marble surface, and it spun in a slow circle for a few moments before landing alone and empty, just like the future he had built for himself. Reginald and Catherine seemed to age 10 years in just a few minutes. They stood up and began to shuffle toward the door, looking small and defeated without the Newport masks they had worn so proudly. Preston tried to mutter one last meaningless threat about high-priced lawyers and compensation, but I called his name and made him stop in his tracks. I told him that a security team would be at the Willows that afternoon to help them gather their personal belongings before the locks were changed for good. I suggested that he make sure to take those silver tablewares from France he was so proud of because they might actually be useful when he had to find a new place to stay, perhaps in the basement of a halfway house or a cheap motel. My words were the final period at the end of a long and painful sentence, giving them back exactly the kind of future they had tried to reserve for me. When the heavy oak doors finally closed behind the last of the Whitfields, the conference room suddenly seemed to expand and fill with the bright afternoon light reflecting off the Providence harbor. Maria let out a long and heavy sigh of relief, and Anna walked over and leaned her head against my shoulder as we both looked out at the water. I felt a sense of satisfaction and a deep peace flowing through me, but it was not because of what those people had lost. It was because of what we had reclaimed. Justice had been served in the most professional and civil way possible, and I had protected Antonio's legacy and ensured my daughter's future. But most importantly, I had affirmed my own dignity in the face of people who thought that wealth was a substitute for character. I took the hands of Anna and Maria, the two women who were my true family, and I told them it was time to leave this office behind. I gave them the brightest smile I had worn in a decade and told them we had a very important dinner to attend at Russo's and that we were going to invite Mr. Miller from the gardening class to join us for the celebration. The story of Antonia Romano does not end with billion-dollar deals or corporate takeovers, but with a bright, sunny Sunday afternoon in Providence 6 months later. I stand back and watch them from a distance, feeling a magical healing energy in the air. The flashy Willows Mansion now belongs to an arts preservation fund, and the Whitfield family name has faded into the dusty archives of court records. But here in this small garden, scented with fresh lavender, a real life is finally beginning. I see Antonia busy at the outdoor grill preparing a weekend brunch. That 1995 Honda Civic is still parked nearby, but now it is repainted a beautiful sky blue, looking as proud as a historical witness. Anna is helping Mr. Miller prune the antique roses, and the sound of their laughter echoes down the street. Maria is setting the table with handmade ceramic plates they all crafted together at their community class. There is no French silver here, and no social class scrutiny. There is only the smell of grilled sausages, fresh coffee, and a profound sincerity visible in every glance. Anna has grown so much, and she is preparing to open a nonprofit legal clinic for vulnerable women, a step that continues her mother's ideals of justice and protection. As I followed Antonia's journey, I found myself moved to tears more than once. Sometimes we spend our lives sacrificing and staying silent just to earn the approval of people who simply do not deserve us. Antonia taught me that silence is not about enduring. It is about observing. She showed us that being firm is not about hatred, but about setting the boundaries needed to protect our most core values. My dear friends, the greatest lesson Antonia leaves us with is that a woman's dignity does not lie in the size of the check she signs, but in her steadfastness against injustice. Family is not just about bloodlines. It is about the people who are willing to sit with you when the coffee has gone cold. It is the place where you can be yourself without any mask or pretension. Never let anyone use money or status to define your worth as anything less than extraordinary. Does Antonia's story remind you of a moment in your own life? What lesson or message touched your heart the most? I truly want to hear your reflections in the comments below. Let us spread this strength and healing together. Goodbye for now.